Welcome to the first event of this National Bushfire and Climate Summit, drawing on 7 experts in their field for an informative and provocative discussion on where to for Australia in the wake of last summer's unprecedented and devastating bushfires across huge swathes of the nation. And apologies for starting this broadcast late. It's an understatement to say we've had some technical issues. Since the fires, 33 former senior fire and emergency service leaders have come together as the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, supported by the Climate Council, to run 6 events across June and July, and this live panel is the launch pad for the series. The summit is particularly important in ensuring that the severe and shocking impact of the fires and their clear link to climate change is not forgotten by governments as they struggle to deal with the effects of that other global disaster, the coronavirus pandemic. And the findings from the summit will be presented to governments and policymakers in August. Before I set the scene for this discussion and introduce the panellists from across Australia and also the United States, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we're conducting this virtual event: the Bundjalung people, the Watamatigal people, the Wadjak people, the Wurundjeri people, the Bidjigal, Palawa and Yugambeh people, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And in making this acknowledgement, there's an obvious comment to add, that if the non-Indigenous leaders of Australia had been smart enough and open enough to consult Indigenous fire experts over the past decades of increasingly intense firefighting in this country, last summer's fires would not have been as severe. And we're going to hear more about that and justify that statement in this panel discussion. In this age of cynicism, it's been at least reassuring, and without getting too carried away, even inspirational at times, to see Australia's federal and state political leaders come together for united action to meet the threat of the world's biggest pandemic in a century, and to see them listening carefully to the scientists and mostly taking their advice. We would not be having this summit if global political leaders had started listening to the science on climate change and acting on the advice of scientists 40, 30, or even 20 years ago. The world's first climate conference of scientists from 50 nations was held in Geneva in February 1979. They identified an urgent necessity to act to avoid a global catastrophe. In the early 1980s, as a news correspondent in the United States, I reported back to Australia on growing scientific concern about the greenhouse effect and global warming. In 1992, on the eve of the Rio Earth Summit to discuss action on global warming, I presented a discussion on the ABC's Lateline program involving political, business and environmental delegates to the summit. When I looked back at that program recently, I found their arguments depressingly familiar because they've been echoed down the decades ever since. The only real change over that time is that the situation is much worse today and the threatened catastrophe is closer. The world is rapidly warming. The UN Secretary-General's report after last year's Global Climate Summit, and that was in New York in September, implies that on its current trajectory, based on pledges under the Paris Accord, the world will heat up by 3% by the end of this century, twice what we're told might be tolerable, with temperatures even then continuing to rise. A truly cataclysmic outcome. Australians last summer bore witness close up to what the awful force of nature is capable of delivering right now, let alone in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time. This was a force beyond our reckoning, and that is what we're here to analyse tonight, the challenges and the actions needed now. I'm joined from California by Ken Pimlott, the retired director of that state's Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, who in his 34 years of firefighting has done battle with some of the worst blazes the modern world has seen. 10,000 homes lost in 2017, 20,000 in 2018, and 100 dead. Cheryl Durant, after a background of strategic intelligence in Australia's Defence Force, has most recently been at the centre of the Defence Department's frank advice to government on the risks climate change poses to this country, leading the department's Global Change and Energy Sustainability Initiative and establishing the Office of the Defence Climate and Security Advisor. Cheryl is now a fellow of the Institute for Integrated Economic Research, and tonight she's coming to us from Burnie in Tasmania. Professor Leslie Hughes was a lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment reports. and is a climate counsellor with the Climate Council. She's a distinguished professor of biology and pro-vice-chancellor at Macquarie University. Her research is mainly focused on the impact of climate change on species and ecosystems. Naomi Brown is the former CEO of the Australasian Fire and Emergency Service Authorities Council and a board member of the National Aerial Firefighting Centre. As Director of Community Safety for the Victorian Country Fire Authority, she saw close up that state's devastating Black Saturday fires in 2009 and gave evidence at the Royal Commission that followed. Oliver Costello is CEO and founding director of the Fire Sticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation based in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, which had its own exposure to the recent bushfire blitz. Oliver has been directly involved in cultural land management projects with many Indigenous communities across Australia and has a broad range of experience in that field. Amanda McKenzie is the CEO of the Climate Council, an independent, not-for-profit organisation that was established in 2013 after the Abbott government abolished a statutory body called the Climate Commission, which had the brief to give independent advice to government on the science of climate change. The founders of the Climate Council were all former commissioners of the Climate Commission. Greg Mullins is the host of this summit series of discussions and roundtables. He's the former Commissioner for Fire and Rescue in New South Wales, who coordinated responses to many major natural disasters over more than 2 decades and has worked with bushfire fighting authorities in America, Canada, France and Spain. And Greg is a founding member of the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, and he joins us from Sydney. You should also know, and that this panel is absolutely stacked with credibility and integrity. You should also know that this summit has been made possible through community donations. Now, I'm going to start the conversation with Ken Pimlett, who's been on the fire front line in California for decades, where, like Australia, the intensity and frequency of fires has ramped up, particularly over the past decade. And a reminder to the audience that you can fire your questions in either on YouTube or Facebook. Ken, how does it feel to be confronted by a situation that you suddenly realise is beyond your control, is beyond your scope, is beyond your resources?
As these fires continue to increase in intensity, they continue to challenge us in ways that we haven't been challenged before, and obviously very concerned for protecting communities. They're out in front of these conflagrations.
The pattern of the fires, the intensity, the duration, the year-round fires, really now across the seasons, is powerful enough. But some people would still dispute that these fires can and are linked directly to climate change. So the skeptics might say that these weather patterns, that the world's history is a history of change of weather patterns, sometimes dramatic. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say that firefighters are seeing it on the front line, and certainly me, 30-plus year career in California in the fire service before I retired. But more importantly, the thousands of firefighters that have been fighting fires for decades here are all saying the same thing. Clearly, there are changes to our weather patterns, changes to vegetation or vegetative conditions, things that are being directly impacted by climate change. And so firefighters will tell you on the front lines, climate is having a direct impact on the way these fires are burning.
Now, there's a beetle in California that tells the story.
So with the climate change has come more intense drought. And with the more intense and longer duration drought, it's created significant stress on vegetation. And that includes the mixed conifer trees in our Sierra Nevada forest here in California. With the stress on these forests, bark beetles, primarily the western pine beetle, has reached epidemic proportions. We had over 120 million trees succumb to epidemic levels of bark beetle. These trees were stressed by drought. Now we've got in many areas over 80% of the trees in some forest stands are dead. Just a standing tinderbox, but again, directly related to the impacts of a changing climate.
There is an old saying that we should be prepared to learn from history, that if we don't learn from history, we're in trouble. But is it enough to learn from history to be basing what the next fire is going to be on what the last fire was? I mean, have you found in the last decade particularly that you have been ready for the next fire when it came, or you have continually been behind?
It's most certainly important to learn from history and plan going forward. But historically, we've looked at things where we anticipate things are going to burn the way they burned last year. Now we need to be thinking about how they're going to burn the next year and the year after. We need to get way ahead of conditions. Conditions are rapidly outpacing our abilities to catch up. So we need to be thinking 2, 3, 4, maybe 10 steps ahead of where we think these fires are going to burn or how they're going to burn in order to anticipate the kinds of conditions, the impacts to communities, how we're going to treat vegetation to help reduce the impacts of these fires.
Is it fair to say that right at this moment, firefighters in California would not know, really, what the next season might be like, or certainly the season after that? You're in your summer now. So is it fair to say that you would have no idea what the next season is going to be like?
We can anticipate the fires are continue to get worse at the intensity to which they're going to burn. No, we don't know. And so we really absolutely have to anticipate the worst, and we have to be really thinking outside the box in terms of what the conditions are looking like and how we evacuate communities, resources that we bring to bear, all of that.
And there was a time, wasn't there, when the northern and southern hemispheres could each rely on one season ending as the other began. So as the northern hemisphere fire season finished, the resources that the southern hemisphere, let's say Australia and California, that Australia could draw on the resources of the northern hemisphere to assist with the fires here. But that is no longer the case, really, is it? Certainly not in a very clear, cut and dried way.
No, it isn't. These lengthening fire seasons, and in many cases, they're often year-round in either hemisphere, really puts challenges on our ability to share resources across the globe. And this is something that, again, we weren't challenged with to this degree before, but particularly aviation resources, but also our expert resources from our technical professionals, our firefighters that we exchange back and forth between Australia, for example, in the United States. It's difficult. California, we have a hard time letting our firefighters go to support our partners in Australia and other countries when we're still in these extended and protracted fire seasons. So it's definitely putting a strain or creating challenges on our ability to share resources across the globe.
Ken, thanks very much. I'll just see if Greg wants to ask you anything, Greg Mullins, or Greg, do you have any observations on what Ken's had to say in terms of how it relates to Australia?
No, well, look, huge thank you to Ken because it's 1 a.m. in California. Thank you, Ken, for staying up for us. But as he and I have discussed recently, we have this huge overlap of fire seasons. Ken, I know you oversaw an upgrade of CAL FIRE's Air Force from S2 1,200-gallon aircraft to C-130 Hercules to Black Hawks. So an upgrading of aerial resources to try to keep ahead of this beast. But the fact is, countries around the world that have never burned, like Greenland, the UK, they're burning. And countries like America and Australia that are accustomed to fire, they're burning in ways that we've never seen before. And it's driven by climate change. There's no question whatsoever.
I'm going to ask Cheryl.
I just want to point out
Sorry,
how much
Ken. Yeah.
I have appreciated through my career the relationship between the United States and in particular California and our Australian partners. But Greg is absolutely spot on. These fires are burning in ways that we could never have imagined when we started our careers or working through them. And again, as Greg indicated, we're in California bringing on additional resources. We've been working on upgrading aviation, staffing firefighters year-round. Now, all that certainly comes at a cost, but it's all in response to, again, these changing conditions that are directly related to climate change and the impacts from that.
Ken Pimlett, thanks very much for joining us. And I know the time in California, so and I know you're going to leave us at this point, but thank you very much for taking the time.
Cheryl, thank you all very much.
Yep. Thanks, Ken.
Cheryl Durant, until very recently, you were at the heart of the Defence Department's analysis of climate change as a serious national security risk to Australia. Military culture is well used to applying cold hard logic to risk, on the battlefield at least, or in protecting borders. But by these assessments that you have been a part of, what sort of threat or risk does climate change present to Australia's national security?
Thanks, Kerry. Defence has been studying climate change, certainly in Australia, for over 10 years and other defence departments for longer. And how we characterise climate change is in two ways. One is a threat multiplier. And what that means is climate change pretty much interacts with every other type of security threat and multiplies it. So we saw with the bushfires, climate change creates those underlying conditions that make the fires more frequent and more intense. That presents dilemmas for defence for having forces available to deal with it. But climate change also impacts upon other aspects of security. It impacts directly on food and water security, and that can create conflict and has created conflict in some areas of the globe. It also creates conditions where people find it difficult to continue to live and earn livelihoods in some countries and some areas. And at some point in time, that's going to create a condition where people will need to move. And migrations themselves create problems both for security, but also have on-flow problems for food and water security and potentially create conflict. The other way climate change is beginning to be looked at by Defence is as an existential risk. And our current Chief of Defence Force has put climate change up there along with Great Power War as one of the real big risks that Defence needs to look at. And as this existential risk, it means it's sort of that really big scale global risks that not just have those local effects or those regional effects, but can actually go and sort of directly impact the way our planet operates. It directly impacts our continued sort of existence on the Earth and our ability to sort of live in the global society that we're used to.
How well prepared, how real, I'm asking, is the threat of breakdown of government and civil society around the globe looking into the future if climate change continues on its current path?
It's a very real threat, Kerry, and this is something that on the current trajectory you can see at some point in time, parts of the planet, particularly in those middle regions, it's difficult to see those regions existing under the projected heat temperatures and the water stress. And that's a particular concern for Defence, because if you think of countries that are sitting in those middle latitudes, you've got nuclear armed countries, you've got India and Pakistan, and you've got water problems already in the South Asian and Southeast Asian watercourses. So you can't sort of predict exactly what the problem that sort of tips the world into sort of global crisis will be. You might have predicted a pandemic or a worse pandemic than we have now. But certainly the climate change is just creating multiple flashpoints for where conflict could occur in the future. In the Arctic, already seeing competition between Russia and America for resources. You're seeing China sort of taking action across the Tibetan watercourses that is certainly going to cause concerns for India and Pakistan. You see countries in the Sahel already having local tribal conflicts exacerbated by climate change. You saw in Europe, when we had mass migration movements, the pressures that put on to sort of European governance and European governments, and how that created a backlash among societies who were dealing with quite small levels of immigration.
So back to the here and now, how well prepared are you able to say were Australian Defence Forces for the range of ways they ended up contributing to last summer's bushfires?
Well, Kerry, I think Defence Forces were well prepared up to a point. And certainly at the operational and tactical level, we'd been studying the increase in domestic or potential for domestic disaster responses, both locally and abroad, for quite some time. We'd war-gamed multiple disasters, we'd war-gamed disasters happening concurrently. But the disasters that occurred last summer were fundamentally different from what we had anticipated. And what was really very, very different was the duration of the operational response phase of the disaster. Normally when you have a crisis like a flood or a fire, it's a crisis that lasts a few days or a few weeks at most. But these crises went on for weeks and for months as the fires moved around Australia. And that creates a lot of ongoing pressure and concurrency dilemmas for Defence, because if we're providing forces in response to domestic disasters of this nature. What they're not doing is training. We already have a saying in defence, every Christmas there's Operation Deny Christmas, because that's when the bushfires and the cyclones strike in the southern hemisphere. But it's not just deny Christmas anymore, it's deny Easter and deny Halloween, and it's pretty much extending the disaster season out so that the opportunity for defence to plan and conduct its major exercises and training that it needs to for all its other missions is becoming very compressed. And that will create problems down the future in making sure that we are able to do our response, plus also do our training.
So I was talking with Ken about in the process of learning from the last disaster, how you go about preparing for the next. I mean, do you base, because we were caught short with these last series of massive fires, do we now prepare for the same fires happening next time, or is it entirely possible that we prepare for something like the last one, but the next one's even worse? In other words, the danger of learning from disasters like the summer is that you're preparing on how to fight the last fire, not the next one. Is that a real issue?
That's an old defence saying is we always prepare for the last war, not the next. And certainly we've got a habit of looking at problems in our rearview mirror. We understand them once they've happened. We understand bushfires at that scale once they've happened at that scale. It's really critical going forward now that we learn from the future. And that requires us to sort of institutionalise some of the futures practices that exist in departments such as defence, but also other areas of government. It's the futures modelling, it's the futures scenarios, and these need to become commonplace rather than occasional exercises. And it's really a combination of the hard data plus the imagination. The world's changing, it's not a stable world, and the changes aren't slow. They're quick changes, they're accelerating, it's a very dynamic environment. And that really requires a different way of thinking about the future.
So what impact, when we talked about the sorts of risk assessments that you were a part of the process of making and presenting to government as part of the military, what impact have the military assessments over the last decade actually had on governments?
Well, I think they've had good effects on the military, but limited effects on government. And one of the problems you appreciate in Australia is that, unlike other countries in the world, climate change has been not a security issue that is bipartisan. It's a very divided political environment. And so while Defence has been able to have good traction within its own department in acting upon climate change, the ability to take that message out of Defence and become part of a broader national security deliberation has been limited.
How limited?
Well, pretty much there was a brief period where there was some sort of receptiveness in government, but by and large, the last 10 years have been a barren field for government action on climate change.
So have the warnings and the risk assessments from Defence resonated on other departments then, if not the politicians?
There's some action that Defence has catalysed across government, but again, it's just not enough. We're getting some go forward, we're getting some action being taken. The crisis is really happening at a scale and urgency which we're not responding at the same pace.
Yeah. Cheryl, thank you very much for your contribution so far, and I know you're going to hang on, and if we have the time towards the end, we might get a little bit of a round robin going. Leslie Hughes, in terms of the science, and you've been knee-deep in the science for a long time now, part of the 4th and 5th IPCC assessments. We've spent the best part of 30 years of global leaders at successive summits identifying climate change as an existential threat to our future. And to what extent is that future here now? After all the talk, to what extent are we seeing the beginning of that future?
Well, Kerry, it has been 30 years of warnings and 30 years of frustration for scientists like myself. The future is definitely here. I think even scientists still occasionally talk about climate change in a future sense, but we shouldn't. Just like we talk about bushfires as natural disasters when they're becoming rapidly very unnatural. So the future is absolutely here. And as my fellow panellists have been indicating, it's not going to get worse before it gets better.
So were you surprised by the intensity and the ferocity and the destruction of the fires of Black Summer?
I think I would distinguish between being shocked and being surprised. As a scientist, no, I wasn't surprised, and I don't think any climate scientist would have been. As a human being living through the bushfire smoke in Sydney, I was shocked, just like everyone, as we watched the news and just saw the devastation and saw the desperation on those people, on the beach at Malakuta. It was an absolutely shocking summer, but not a surprise.
So, as I understand it, you can point to three things that can drive bushfires and the intensity of bushfires: the spark that starts it, the fuel that is there to burn, and the conditions of the day. So, can you say that climate change has impacted on all three in this last summer?
Yes, we can. We've got good evidence. So if we think about the spark, a spark can come from anywhere. It can come from a 10-year-old with a box of matches, or it can come from lightning. We know that climate change is probably not affecting the 10-year-olds with the boxes of matches, but we know that we do get more lightning, dry lightning in particular, in a warmer atmosphere. And there is evidence, including from Tasmania, that lightning strikes have been going up as the world has been warning. But the really important things are the fuel. Once you've got a spark, you need something to burn. And we've had probably what is an unprecedented drought. So we have not only very, very dry fuel, especially our eucalypt forests, which are very flammable anyway, and very, very dry soils. And so with dry fuel, dry soils, as the air passes over that soil, it also dries out. So you've got the literal tinderbox. But then if that spark happens and you've got the dry fuel, it's the conditions on the day that really matter. So if you have a very hot, windy day, the spark can very, very rapidly become a fire that even experienced people like Ken and Greg can't control. So in that sense, the impact of climate change, which has been associated with increasing severity of heat waves, just more hot, extreme days, the connection is actually pretty logical and pretty simple. We don't need to overcomplicate things. If we've got drought, we've got dry fuel, we've got hot days, we get out of control bushfires.
So I think it's true of California and true of Australia, two very prosperous, well-resourced countries, that at times the firefighters in both countries were powerless in the face of the intensity and force and just the sheer front of these fires. What do you take from that?
Well, it should be a warning about the future. I mean, if we think about the Californian situation in particular, California is probably the best resourced firefighting service in the world, and they couldn't stop the town of Paradise being completely wiped out and the loss of 14,000 homes. Our own fire service, which is, mostly pretty good, were absolutely powerless in many cases to stop things like that Gospers Mountain fire. And it burnt and burnt and burnt for weeks. So this should be a warning of what we're facing down the track. The resources that we have to put into emergency services must be greatly increased, because we could have another year like this next year. And if not next year, the year after or the year after that. I think we've got to not think about last summer as a one-off series of events. It's a warning for the future.
The UN Secretary-General's report after yet another global summit last year, the one in New York in September, the report implied that the world is on a pathway, this is even if people live up to their pledges at Paris, that the world is on a pathway for a 3-degree increase in global warming by the end of the century. Now, we know that would be devastating if we get to that would be catastrophic. How do we apply that to the kinds of weather events we're now regularly seeing already with greater intensity and greater frequency?
Well, what the world has had so far is about a 1.1 degree of annual temperature warming. So if we think about the summer that we just had with 1.1 degrees, we can sort of extrapolate as to what we might expect with 3 degrees or even 2 degrees. the Paris Climate Agreement, which we are a signatory to, aims to keep warming to less than 1.5 degrees, and if not, at least less than 2 degrees. Unfortunately, all of the pledges that have been made by all the countries who are signatories to the Paris Agreement, if all of those pledges are met perfectly and on time, we'll still get about 2.7 to 3 degrees. So that tells us that our pledges are not enough. And many countries are failing to meet those pledges. Now, Australia's pledge is woefully inadequate. They were advised by the Climate Change Authority to go for a 45 to 60% reduction on 2005 emissions levels by, the next decade. The government chose to go for 26 to 28% reduction instead, so that the target is not enough, and we are failing to meet that target.
Leslie, thanks so far for your contribution. And Greg, I don't know, do you want to add anything?
I'd just make the observation that my group, former fire chiefs, and the observation of what Cheryl said as well, public servants aren't allowed to speak about climate change. We saw on Four Corners recently, ex-head of Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Treasury. We've all been gagged, not allowed to talk about this stuff, so nothing's being done about it. And what Leslie's saying, the science, we've watched it. I've watched it over 50 years change. Less rainfall, hotter conditions, far more days of very high fire danger and above, and then catastrophic fire danger with pyroconvective storms that we never used to get, never seen one until recent years. You can't fight these fires, and climate change is here now, and it's just going to get worse.
Okay, I'm going to go to Naomi Brown now, and from your long experience and background in fire and emergency services, Naomi, including on the research front, what did you take from last summer's fires?
For me, Kerry, a bit like Leslie was saying, was the shock. For me, climate change suddenly went from an intellectual exercise, which has been going on, 20 or so years, to a reality that really, I think, hit me in the gut, saying this is it, it's here, it's not the future, it is here right now. We have seen, I think, instances earlier, as far back probably as the fires in Canberra in 2003, the fire behaviour there was quite remarkable. Then, of course, in Victoria in 2009, but the length and the amount that was burnt, and for me, the fact that it moved from what's often a state issue to a national issue, and it did that very quickly, and it opens up a whole new way of managing fires like the one that we saw last summer.
Is it inevitable that we're going to see a greater role for the Australian military and military personnel in fighting future fires?
Yes, I think it was the Defence have often had a role in these very large events, but to date, the planning for it and getting there has been somewhat complicated, and it has been often rather late in the piece. And so what I think what we're all hoping will come out of this is much more joint planning with everybody involved in Defence at the beginning, so that really good use can be made of all of their skills in, logistics, evacuation, aerial surveillance, and so on, and not make the step from using state resources to using Defence resources a difficult step. Can I say that there's one thing that I don't think anybody would be looking for, and I'm sure Cheryl would be first to say this, when nobody wants Defence out there fighting fires. I don't think that's their role. I think training up the Defence to do this would be a waste of everybody's time. We've got really good state fire services, but what Defence can bring is a huge amount of skill and capacity that is needed.
But there were times during the summer when before our eyes, as we watched from our various distances around Australia, firefighters, their faces etched with exhaustion. How they didn't drop on the spot is beyond me. Firefighters died as much as anything from fatigue and exhaustion. That's how we all make mistakes. So what more has to happen? How big does the government response, the combined response of governments, have to be to get us to a stage, not even to be able to fight last summer's fires, let alone whatever is coming down the tunnel?
Can I say that there's sort of two parts to that? One is a much bigger picture, which doesn't solve any fire for next year or the year after. But if some real action isn't taken right now to look to the future so that we at least have some chance of lessening what we saw last summer, then it's going to be beyond everybody's capacity to respond. So there's a big and important actions that really have to start right now and be very serious. And that does revolve around emissions and everything else around climate change. In that, as I said, that's not going to solve next summer's fire or the year after. So the one of the very big important things is I think a big cooperative effort, which I've got to say that fire services really, they're good at doing now. They can organise themselves and have done for many years and brought in people, from California and so on. But I think it's going to need a much bigger input and support for big resources like aerial firefighting, which no doubt is expensive. Last summer, the support for that came very late in the day. It was too late to extend a lot of the contracts. The aircraft were going elsewhere. So there's some really big things like that which are incredibly supportive to the firefighters on the ground. They certainly don't do away with that, but that would be enormously helpful.
But the whole ball game has changed, hasn't it? I mean, there was a time, and I remember the Canberra fires. They were drawing on firefighters from all over the rest of the eastern states. Traditionally, Australian firefighters have been able to draw on resources from California and vice versa. And you heard Ken. I mean, the situation is now virtually constant in California, and the chances of being able, the guarantees are off the board, aren't they? There is no guarantee that if each state is fighting its own intense fires, they've got fewer resources to lend to somebody else.
Yes, the fire seasons used to be a lot more discreet than they are now. So, for instance, in August, you might have expected, the very north of Queensland and Northern Territory, and nothing much happening in the south. Well, as we all know, that's changed. And also, not just in California, but in Europe, Portugal, Spain, France, those fire seasons were all overlapping, and everybody needs the same sort of resources. I suspect Australia, at the very least, is going to have to invest a lot more in some of its own aircraft. We have been leasing, so we do have aircraft, obviously, but a lot of it goes around the world. I think that much more expenditure on that is going to be really, really important. I think it's also just going to the actual firefighters themselves. Volunteers, not only do they need a lot of support, I think people need to understand that as a cohort, they are ageing, like the rest of us, quite frankly. And, attracting people into that is not quite as easy as it used to be. Rural areas in particular aren't as well populated as they used to be, and the commitment is quite difficult and so on. So there's a lot of issues that fire services are extremely well aware of and work very hard to do, but it just highlights that it's not just the bigger fires, but the capacity we have to actually deal with it. Yeah. There are quite a few matters in there that also need a lot of attention, I think, and ongoing attention, not just a one-off, but a recognition that this is part of what we have to be able to do and do well.
Okay, Naomi, thanks for that. And Oliver Costello, apart from climate change, I'd like to hear your anatomy of the bushfire catastrophe last summer from the perspective of somebody with an Indigenous background and expertise in the issue of firefighting.
Thanks, Kerry. And I'd just like to acknowledge country and say hi to everyone. So yeah, that last season was, it's hard to describe, the comments around it, being shocked but not surprised, in the sense that, the time I've spent over the last, 15 or 20 years sort of learning about fire management and land management, and just seeing, I guess, the build up and fuel, a lot of sea country, and knowing how climate change is driving all these extreme conditions. It was appalling to see the devastation over such large areas of country, and knowing that country and knowing the communities that are connected to it is really horrifying. And I guess from my point of view, we're really keen to build awareness around the role of cultural land management. Our ancestors looked after this land for thousands of years through quite extreme changes in climate over long periods of time. Climate change is happening much faster now because of the actions of people in the world, and we need to take heed and understand that role and responsibility that we have. And that's really what, I guess, cultural fire management's taught me, is that, you need to understand the landscape, you need to understand people's connection to it, you need to manage it in a way so that it responds. And that's really what happened, but we're not seeing enough of it in the landscape. We're seeing a lot of mismanaged land, we're seeing a lot of pollution and climate impacts that are driving these extreme conditions.
So how different might it have been? How different might the landscape have been if, from your perspective, proper land practice had been applied?
Yeah, that's one of the hard things, Kerry, as an Aboriginal person, and for the knowledge that I've learned, I'm just a young man in the world. I don't know everything about cultural fire and land management, but from what I do know, if a lot of what I know now had been applied since I started learning about it over the last 10 or 15 years, would have had a massive impact. Imagine if that had have never stopped over the last couple hundred years. Even with the climate conditions that we have now, I would imagine there would have been some extreme fire behaviour, but the impacts of that fire on country would have definitely been reduced. There's no doubt about that. We can take you to places where we've done cultural burning, because the way that if you burn in the right way for the country, the fire will still come, but the fire, and this is the principle of hazard reduction, when the fires come in, if there's no fuel, the fire will go out. But when we do cultural burning, it's not just about reducing fuel, it's reducing the resilience of the landscape to respond to the impacts of fire and other impacts. And so there's areas that we burnt. Just for example, at Bundanon Trust, we ran the National Indigenous Fire Workshop in 2018. The young crew there, Ewan and Durrell crew, burnt for a couple of weeks around Bundanon. And when the fire came in there, the fire went out, and they could stand at the edge of where one fire went out, the one that they lit a couple of years ago, and the fire went out a couple of months back, and you can just see the stark difference. You can see the moisture in the good country that they burnt, grasses coming back, and you can see the positive energy that comes through that in practice. And so imagine if that was at a landscape scale across all these areas. I know a lot of this country that's been burnt, it's been burnt the wrong way, and it hasn't been managed properly for decades and centuries. And we need, that's something that we can start doing now. We can start burning the right way. We can start doing other land management activities, and we can also start to deal with the climate change issues as well, because it's going to take decades and centuries to reverse the climate impacts and the climate changes. So we need to be ahead of the game. We need to be dealing with the land management right now at the same time as dealing with the drivers of the climate. Otherwise, we're going to this is a ticking time bomb. 10, 15 years' time, I would not be surprised to see extreme fires as we've seen, even before, but in the areas that have just been burnt are probably going to be ripe to go in 10 or 15 years.
So it's partly about canopies less protected, isn't it? It's about canopies going with the undergrowth as well, where once upon a time the canopies would have been preserved and the trees would have lived. So, so the forests are much more dense now.
Yeah, so there's a whole heap of different factors, but generally, one of the key principles is protecting the canopy. And that's one of the issues that we see with hazard reduction. We see a lot of intensity of hazard reduction that actually impacts the canopy. And what that does is let light into the ground and create a lot of germination response. And often you end up with these mid-story shrub layers and mid-story sort of canopies that become highly combustible, particularly under the extreme conditions where you have drought, you have high winds, you have high intensity heat. Areas that of vegetation that might be hard to burn in a hazard reduction, might be hard to burn under certain conditions, are really primed to burn under extreme conditions that we're seeing through climate change. And that's why some of this fire intensity and the extent and, huge areas like such massive fires with, and sometimes, if you even areas that you would have done hazard reduction or cultural burning, it's just not going to stand up in under those extreme conditions. But if you have that at a landscape scale, you're giving yourself an edge. You're giving habitat for refuge, for animals and plants. You're creating the best opportunity that we have in a changing climate for the resilience of that landscape and the protection of communities. There's areas where, like the old people traditionally would always burn around their hunting grounds, their camping areas. Like you're producing ecosystems that have cultural landscapes within them, and that's what we need more of. We need to understand the landscape and how to apply fire if we want to see these impacts reduced. As the extreme conditions will continue to come, there's going to be more and more extreme conditions. We need to really get ahead of the curve.
Oliver, thank you for your contribution. Amanda McKenzie, putting together the expert insights from our discussion so far, where do we have to go from here as a nation? And do you discern an increased urgency at a political level as a result of the summer to act as a result?
Thanks, Kerry. Well, I think during the summer, the pressure definitely was increased on the federal government. You look at the shift in statements from the start of the summer to the end of the summer. You might remember at the start, there was different politicians from the Nationals, for instance, casting doubt on whether climate change was influencing the event and saying, we can't talk about climate change at this time. Whereas then by the end of the summer, it was impossible for any politician really to deny that climate change was influencing these events. And we had the Royal Commission initiated. But that said, that pressure has not translated to substantive policy action. We're still in a federal policy vacuum. There's been no effective policies brought in by this government, which is, now many years underway. The most effective policies that exist are still in train from previous governments. The renewable energy target, for instance, which ends this year. So there's a policy vacuum in many different areas of the response to climate change, including renewable energy.
You described Scott Morrison's claims of effective Australian action on climate change in his speech to the United Nations in September as colossal bullshit. Fairly plainly said. What do you think of his policies now in the wake of the summer's bushfires?
Well, there's been no change since I made that statement last year. Australia has positioned itself internationally to say that we're doing something, that we're on track to meet our emission reduction targets, etc. There's been a lot of discussion around accounting tricks to meet those targets. But ultimately, the targets are very weak. As Leslie said, we need to go far beyond what we've agreed at the Paris Climate Summit. We're right at the back of the pack compared to other countries. And people say, oh, well, Australia's small. Well, that's not true. We're in the top 20 emitters globally. There's 180 countries that pollute less than we do. And if you look at us on a per capita basis, we're right up the top. And again, if you look at us from an export perspective, we're one of the biggest coal exporters and biggest gas exporters in the world. So we're a very significant player, and we have continued to play a problematic role globally. Not only are we not meeting we haven't been meeting our targets, but our emissions have been going up and up.
So the federal government is now identifying natural gas as a lesser evil than coal and therefore a sensible transition fuel to a cleaner, greener future. They have a logic there in the sense that there may be the need for a transition while the alternative energy sources actually build. Now, do you give that credence or not?
No, that's got no credibility. There's the main agencies, the Australian Energy Market Operator, for instance, says you can go to 75% renewable energy from now without any need for new natural gas. We have gas in the system already. We don't need any new gas for the transition. What we need to do is invest in renewable energy backed up by storage. And storage can be batteries, it can be pumped hydro. There's a range of different technologies there. The push for gas would see us have gas in the mix for the next 100 years. So there's no transition. Once you create a set of vested interests, they're not going away anytime soon, just like we've seen with the coal industry and the gas industry to date. And the idea that gas is clean is another piece of colossal bullshit. If you look at how the pollution from gas, of course, it's still a fossil fuel. As you burn methane, it creates carbon dioxide. But also from the mining of gas, fugitive emissions are not measured very well in Australia. Fugitive emissions are the pollution created when you mine gas. Often gas can seep out of seams in the ground, etc. Gas can leak during transportation and other things. And that's releasing methane direct to the atmosphere. And methane is much more polluting than carbon dioxide. So when you put the picture together for gas and then you add in the economic ramifications, renewable energy is now the cheapest source of new fuel. There's just no need to go down the gas pathway. It makes no sense except for the vested interest in gas.
So we've seen an increasing number of American states moving to fill the gap on climate change left by Congress and the White House, certainly the Trump White House. But no White House has been particularly successful in forcing through policy. To what extent can the states here, and for that matter local government, make up for the failures in Canberra?
Well, that's exactly where we're seeing the leadership in Australia. We've got almost all states now have a net zero target by 2050. Most of them have a significant renewable energy target by 2025 or 2030. So most of the states are really moving. A lot of local governments have really been leading the way as well. And the thing is, a lot of the climate movement has been pushing the federal government for years to act, and we just haven't got tangible outcomes from the federal government. So we can't necessarily expect that they're going to lead in the future. I think that we need to do far more to push states further, to push local governments further, to lead the way. And in fact, local and state governments together represent a majority of the emissions that we need to be getting down. So we can make a big difference through those avenues.
We get mixed signals from business. I mean, a lot of businesses individually make noises of being in support of recognising climate change, recognise the need for reduced emissions and so on. But then collectively, sometimes the organisations that represent them send another picture. I mean, how optimistic are you that big business is really prepared to get behind the actions you believe we need without being forced to do so?
I think big business globally has demonstrated that there is a lot of concern around climate change. There's now lots of huge companies from Unilever to a range of different other ones that have signed up to RE 100. That's going to 100% renewable energy. And that's happening now in Australia quite significantly. Business leaders are often reluctant to speak out on the issue because it's been so politicised, but I think they need to step up and be much braver. You look at Greg Mullins, the emergency leaders, I think they've been enormously powerful to come out with such credibility and say, this is happening, it's impacting us, and we need to do far more. We need to see business leaders taking that leadership in the Australian community because it's just so absent at the federal level from our politicians. So that's been a notable absence in our environment. So I think for those watching, if you're looking for some place to agitating within corporations that you might work for or to corporations is a really important piece of the puzzle.
Okay, I'm going to go to questions that we've received from our our virtual audience at large. But just before I do, I want to hear one more comment from Greg. You've now heard from a range of expert opinion across the spectrum, really. What do you take from it?
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. Look, so we've heard it's a global problem. Fires are getting worse. Natural disasters across the board are getting worse because of extreme weather. So the weather's driving this. What's driving the weather? Changes in climate. And I've been around long enough in this game to actually watch it happen and see how the fire seasons are closer together, the bad ones. They're longer, they're overlapping. Naomi talked about sharing resources between states and territories. That was our operational paradigm for decades, and we can't now. Every state burns at once. We heard from Leslie, the science has been around for years, but nobody listened until it whacked them in the head last year. We heard from Cheryl that in a policy sense, it's just don't listen. And we're not allowed to talk about it. We were sidelined and not listened to because it was inconvenient to talk about this terrible thing that might stop us selling coal. The Indigenous peoples of this land who could have done something about it have been sidelined from the start, taken off their land, not listened to, not respected. So look, we need a huge change, and we can talk about extra firefighting aeroplanes, more hazard reduction, whatever. It won't cope with what's with us now and going to get worse. It's the analogy of the boiling pot on the stove. You can keep mopping up the water that spills over, but you actually got to turn the stove off. So we've got to dial down the temperature, not for us, but for the benefit of future generations. And I've got grandkids now, and I'm very, very focused because they're going to inherit a world that's maybe unlivable.
I'm going to put a question to you, Cheryl, which I find interesting, and that is, what are other defence forces doing around the world to prepare for climate change?
Thanks, Kerry. I guess it's a mixed bag on what defence forces are doing on climate change. The US was one of the first adopters, if you like. They were moving forward under Barack Obama's administration quite effectively. They did really good assessments of the exposure of their naval bases and airfields to climate change. They understood the sea level rise impacts on their coastal infrastructure. They were beginning to plan to adapt to that. They also understood the need to look beyond the internal aspect of climate change on defence forces and understand how it's going to reshape the region. It's going to reshape competition in Antarctica, and they certainly had understood that, and they actually started building capability to different specifications. They mandated that all ships needed to be ice-capable ships as they look forward to the future. So certainly for many years, American defence forces were certainly in the western side of the business, global leaders on climate change. New Zealand also has a defence climate change statement, so they again have looked both internally at the threat directly to defence forces, but also how this shapes the Pacific and how it shapes New Zealand access to Antarctic resources. The UK, again, looking forward on climate change and defence. They even had a defence leader who was a UK special envoy on climate change, Admiral Neil Morissetti, and had understood, again, climate change risks. So defence forces around the world have succeeded when there's been political will in getting a lot of change and a lot of action. But that only lasts, as we see in America, while that political will is there to support defence action, because defence forces can't act alone. They're really one of the departments of state that needs to act on climate change. And without integration as part of a national security strategy, which some nations have and we don't, doesn't get you very far.
It absolutely intrigues me how the Conservative Party in America, the Republican Party, is a party that is very responsive on defence issues and holds its military in very high regard. And yet they've been deaf to the assessments put in front of them by the military over a very long period of time. Do you understand that?
I think it's one of the, I've read a lot of the psychology on climate change communication, Kerry, and it's almost like you retreat inside that thought bubble of your own community and you just stop listening to anyone coming from a different angle. And I'm just constantly grateful that Australia's not there yet. We're not like America, where there's such a polarised thought bubble on left and right that ideas don't move between the two sides. But we need to be concerned that we might get there.
So this is a question I'll direct to Amanda, but anyone else is welcome to come in on it if they like. How can we, the people, overcome the fossil fuel industry influence in governments through games of mates and political donations?
Well, it's $1 million question, isn't it? And it's a thing that's been preventing climate action for all of these years. I think that the power is when people come together and make a big impact together. And you're seeing that in the Black Lives Matter movement right now, how the power of people coming together to change the cultural dynamics around an issue. I think with climate change, it can feel like an issue that's far away. I think the bushfires showed Australians that this is here, it's now. And I think there's a real latent concern in the community that the COVID issue meant that we kind of refocus our attention on the pandemic. But I think there's a deep level of concern that was highly elevated during the bushfires, and it's time to reignite that. And I hope that the work that we're doing with this Bushfire Summit is one of the pieces of the puzzle in doing that. There's, of course, other opportunities to agitate for change. And I think what Greg and the emergency leaders have done, as I said, in bringing together those that have a platform together and then using that platform to create a really big impact has been very powerful. I'd love to see more of that. But I also think we need to shift our advocacy targets. It can't just be asking the federal government to do more. We have to be putting pressure on state governments, local governments and businesses to change their tactics. It can't just be up to the federal government, because as we've seen over the last 15, 20 years, we just haven't seen the outcomes. We are seeing more change at the state and local government level, and we need business to be stepping up too.
Leslie, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, thanks, Kerry. Yeah, look, one of the things that's come out of the pandemic and how really successfully places like Australia and New Zealand have handled it is, and I'm not the first person to say this, but governments have been listening to the scientists. They've been deferring
How did that make you
to
feel?
the expertise of people that know. If only they'd been doing that with climate science as well. We wouldn't be in the situation that we're in now. So I'm hoping that as we come out of the pandemic, there really will be solid lessons that our governments have learnt about listening to experts, about prioritising threats, about acting early, because it's those three things that mean that we're in a lot better shape from the pandemic here in Australia and places like New Zealand than many, many other countries. Let's use those lessons well.
So, in fact, if you've now got this new dynamic of a national cabinet, where the premiers get together perhaps more frequently and within in a different spirit, if you like, than the old premiers' conferences of the past, to tackle urgent problems urgently and to try and find common ground, that perhaps there might be a strength come from that can hold those vested interests at arm's length who are distorting and warping the debate.
Yes, look, absolutely. I think one of the things we've got to do is stop talking about climate change as purely an environmental problem as well. It's part of that communication piece that Cheryl mentioned. It is an enormous environmental problem, of course, but it's also, as we saw from the impacts of the bushfires, it's an extraordinary security problem. It's an economic problem. It's a problem for everything. So our national cabinet should be a national cabinet of climate change response and mitigation, because climate change is affecting more than the Great Barrier Reef. You know, it's affecting our communities, our health, everything about our lives. So if we encourage our governments to take a far more holistic approach to dealing with impacts and to the solutions for those impacts, we'll be in a better position. I mean, the one good thing about the humans affecting the climate is that we understand the science and we know what's causing climate change. And because we know that, we have that knowledge, we also have the means at our disposal to fix it. We actually don't need any new technology. You know, we've got the technology at hand, we just have to employ it.
Let me give you an example of the dynamics of how people's opinions can operate. Before Australia was considering going into Iraq in 2003 in support of the US invasion to get rid of Saddam Hussein, there was a huge majority of Australians who, according to opinion polls, were opposed to Australia going into the war. But the moment John Howard committed Australian troops to Iraq, opinion swung behind the troops because people didn't want to feel disloyal to the troops. You've now got a situation where, before the pandemic, there was a great deal of concern about the lack of action on climate change as a result, as the penny dropped about the summer fires. Along comes the pandemic. Massive amounts of money are released into the economy to try and balance the damage that's being done. We are in recession now, even as the pandemic continues. Nobody knows how bad it's going to be, but we do know that more jobs are going to be lost and that it's going to get worse before it gets better, and we could be recovering from this recession for the next 4, 5, 6 years. So isn't it inevitable that the attention of governments is going to be diluted, and that industries like the coal industry and even trade unions are going to be saying, we need to protect jobs? Now, how do you answer that? We need to protect jobs, and if climate change action is going to cost more jobs, we can't afford it.
Well, I think Amanda hit the nail on the head earlier, by saying that, we need energy to run our economy, run our communities. New renewables is now cheaper than new fossil fuel. So there's lots and lots of modelling being done now to show that a green stimulus, a green economic stimulus will create far more jobs, will get Australia back on track. I personally think it's a missed opportunity in terms of the latest current economic stimulus to give people money to build new kitchens or whatever. That money, in my view, should be going into a green stimulus to rebuild our economy based on renewable energy. That's where we'll create jobs.
Anyone else want to comment? Amanda?
I can jump in there, Kerry. A number of organisations have now done great modelling around what the opportunities are. WWF has released some work over the weekend showing the opportunities for a renewable energy export industry, for instance, so we could be making clean fuels and exporting them to the world. There's opportunities in manufacturing a bus fleet, for instance, that they've come up with around electric buses. Beyond Zero Emissions have done some work looking at how you can create 1 million jobs in this environment through economic stimulus. And we're doing our own work at the Climate Council that will be released in early July, looking at some detailed economic modelling across all areas of responding to the climate crisis. So not just renewable energy, but also how do we electrify transport, manufacturing, some heavy industry? How do we reshape our landscapes, and how do we adapt to climate change? So, for instance, Oliver's group would be a great one to be funding in this scenario, where we're thinking about, well, how do we prepare for worsening fire conditions? We need to have more cultural burning as one of those options. There's a huge amount that we could do on climate change that can be getting people into work. You think about the Great Barrier Reef catchment, for instance, big biodiversity projects where you're planting vegetation that is also helping biodiversity, it's helping landscapes, it's reducing runoff to the reef, and it's also reducing emissions. You can find these win-win solutions, and that's the sort of clever policy we need right now to set ourselves up for the future. This will be a huge missed opportunity if we just continue down the same pathway. It'll be devastating.
Greg, you talked yourself before about the importance of dealing Indigenous expertise into this picture, but the firefighting authorities themselves over the decades have been a part of this process of a blind eye or a deaf ear to that same expertise, have they not? I mean, has that been a lost opportunity in the culture of firefighting, of established firefighting in Australia?
Oh, look, absolutely, and I won't make any excuses because actually Oliver spoke to me years ago about this and what can we do to try and support this sort of burning, and he didn't get a lot of joy from any of the fire services because we didn't quite understand it. And now that we're understanding it a little bit more, it's the technology that they've had for tens of thousands of years is that far beyond what we use. in my RFS brigade with a drip torch and how we burn things. It's unbelievable. So we need to tap that knowledge and show a bit of bloody respect that's been lacking for 200 years. And these people actually know how to manage this land. So we've got to go back to basics. And, you know, and you will find fire agencies trying to recruit more Indigenous people, but that's that much. We've got to do so much more. And there does need to be a lot of funding. Oliver and Victor Stevenson and others can't do what they're good at without funding. You can't just do it for nothing. So we have to get communities involved and have those communities as part of the solution.
But do you think that the penny has dropped for within the firefighting culture of Australia about that point?
Look, I hate to say,
I mean,
but
you're
no.
talking about a big shift being required. Is the Australian firefighting culture and authority ready for that shift?
I don't think so. I think, people like me have to do a lot more work to educate, because I was out fighting the fires, as you know, as a volunteer. That's retirement for me. A lot of firefighters on the front line haven't got the time or the inclination to worry about what led to this, and a lot of them haven't been around for 50 years, like I have, on a fire truck, and didn't have a dad who was doing it from the 1930s. So they don't have that knowledge. So ELCA, the 33 fire and emergency chiefs, we've got a big education job ahead of us to say, here's how it's changed. You weren't around when all this was happening, but the seasons are longer, etc., etc. And here's the sort of things that we need to do, but we need to reach out to our Indigenous brothers and sisters, because they've got knowledge that we pushed off to the side, and they're part of the solution if we let them be. So there's a lot going on in AFAC, the peak body, but it doesn't flow down too far. And again, people like me not educating people enough.
Just before we go, very quickly, you've got events through the rest of June and into July, and then in August, you are hoping to put together a substantial case to take to government, correct?
That's right, Kerry. So 29th of July, tune in again. We'll have all the technical stuff sorted by then, I promise.
29th of July or June?
That'll be a wrap-up. We'll try to have a face-to-face summit in 2021, but we'll be... The difference between the Royal Commission, the bushfire inquiries, they've got terms of reference. They're racing to a finish line of July and August. They're very limited in the number of people they can bring to the party. We're opening up. We're forming networks that we hope will go on. We hope that we'll bring different perspectives that we can put to the Royal Commission, which we will do. We'll put a written submission to the Royal Commission in addition to the one we've already put in. And look, there's listeners tonight, a lot of you might be thinking, what about fuel reduction burning? And I'll tell you, my brigade, we've been wanting to put in about 10 burns over the last few weeks, but guess what? It's raining. So, you know, the windows are closing, etc. Climate-driven changes. There's a whole lot of things, building standards, the bureaucracy in Canberra, Emergency Management Australia being subsumed, and no one really knows where it is anymore. But so look, there's a lot there. So tune in July to hear what the experts come up with. And thank you for listening tonight, everybody. Thank you to those who helped us run this, because without your support, we couldn't do it.
So thank you very much to our panellists, and thank you to you, the audience, for joining us tonight. And as Greg said, more to come. Good night.